Welcome to Code and Concrete, the leading podcast for prop tech, conversations about the built environment, and other exciting innovations. If you learn something new, please consider following and leaving a positive review. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. We're coming to you live from ETH Denver. This is a special podcast episode for Code and Concrete where I have two extra special people joining me in the studio. And this is actually more like a panel conversation, which is going to be really exciting because the wealth of knowledge between the two of you is extraordinary. And just the setting where we are in Denver, Colorado, and all of the DAO and decentralized activity aligns so heavily with what we want to cover today. First, I'll introduce the both of you. So I have first, Ramona, can you help me with your last name? How do I pronounce that?
Ramona Tudorancea.
All right.
Ramona. Ramona is enough.
I could never say it so eloquently. Well, you bring over 15 years of experience structuring merger and acquisition deals, offshore funds, and digital asset projects across the U.S. and Europe, and the Caribbean, blending governance expertise. And you have the art of future living philosophy. I think we'll dive into that a little bit later. And then alongside her, we have Larry Bridgesmith. You're a leader in legal and technology project management, and you integrate AI. You've got cybersecurity and blockchain. And you really focus on data-sensitive organizations. And we were talking about that earlier, and we'll kind of unpack what the repercussions are and why that's super important there. First, I'd like to give you both the floor. If you want to take 60 seconds each and give yourselves a proper intro now that we kind of know that, what space you're operating in and why we're on the Code and Concrete podcast in the first place.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. My background is more of a traditional lawyer turned, legal engineer down the rabbit hole of digital assets. I went from, this is interesting to, this is transformative and this could transform our business models. I discovered systems thinking, then permaculture. And then I was like, oh my God, we've been doing things so wrong, creating so much of our own problems and so much waste. And then how do we apply that back into reinventing law with some Web3 magic? And this is where I've been for the last few years. Building better legal systems, better legal framework towards the future we want to be building in.
A huge opportunity for sure. And we have to pay attention to it. Larry, I'll let you do the intro in a second here, but another callback to our conversation earlier, talking about the legal system and how it's not working for people. And if you look at the state of the U.S. right now, there's a lot of fracture, there's a lot of insecurity and instability. And we have to ask, how do we start to rebuild these systems or just replace them altogether? And that's the inflection point with Web3. We might actually have an opportunity to do that. Anyways, Larry, your background.
You're making me excited all the more every time you go down one of these paths. I have been a lawyer because at a very early age as a young adult, I realized how totally dysfunctional organizations were in terms of their sustainability, their productivity, profitability, but most importantly, the human in those organizations and the way in which exploitative management was really the norm and what made the difference between successful organizations economically, but unsustainably, which is what took me into law, not really understanding at the time that it was about systems rather than about rights. I fought for the rights, and I loved being a litigator, and until I realized, wait a minute, my clients don't want to see me in court. They want to have their problems solved sooner and better. And that's what really shifted my thinking from being the warrior in a pinstripe suit to how can systems help us change the way justice is administered and brought to the people who need it the most.
Well, let's jump into that right away. Changing these systems so that they have more favorable or equitable outcomes. How do you see decentralized technology, maybe DAOs, playing a role in that? And what is the main driver? Is it that we're going to be doing something more efficiently, more transparently, or is there a deeper rooted problem like failure of our centralized institutions as they currently exist? How do we make this shift and why?
I'm happy to run with that one for a little bit because that just really ticks all my check boxes. Again, the The organizations that I knew as a young adult were highly centralized, highly exploitative, and very inefficient, plus very unsustainable in their employee relationship. So that's what sent me down a path that said this centralization is really a magnet for exploitation and a magnet for control and power and fighting for it. What alternatives are there? And then you look back in history and you see that centralization has not always been a part of organizations. There are many, many examples historically of very effective interdependent organizations like guilds, and in many cases, even tribal organizations that had a way to solve their problems without exploitation, without the exercise of power and control. And so that's what sent me back to look at those examples. And I'm personally a big fan of how decentralized technology can help us. But I think at its core, it's a people problem. I mean, technology can be there, but it's not the solution. You have to create a culture and an ecosystem of relationships that are truly independent, interdependent, accountable, transparent, and willing to be viewed and predictable in their behavior. Go ahead.
That's a beautiful question, and that's a beautiful way to put it, Larry, because it's when I initially got into this DAO space, right? It's like, oh, this is a new phenomenon, evolution of organizations, started to look into, okay, so how does it work? How do people coordinate? And I found them to be an emergent phenomenon that it was very hard for me to grasp without investing a lot of time. And then I got sort of more interested in looking at it from a biology lens. And I had the fortune of working in a group with biologists and like, okay, let's try to make a taxonomy of DAOs. Let's look at them as new legal animals. Like, what are they? And from there, it got me thinking about, well, the evolution of organizations in general, right? Is like we humans are wired for connection. In the traditional organizations, that connection is very much on a vertical, right? In terms of like subordination, hierarchy, getting paid to do something. But the bonds, the horizontal bonds are perhaps not as strong, right? Now with DAOs, we're seeing the opposite effect, but reality, it's going to be both and, right? It's going to be both the vertical and the horizontal together into new shapes and forms, in new types of organizations that will be becoming more agile as they integrate with AI agents as well, and will become more responsive to their environment and more efficient. The key, though, and this is something I've been flagging in terms of like, not everybody wants to be in a swarm because not everybody wants that coordination at the lowest level. Let's allow for more flexibility in terms of the variety of structures that people are experimenting with, and let's be cautious about what we're building into the system in terms of like, I love the Web3 ecosystem because it sort of pressure point for people to evolve into a more empowered version of themselves, into having more personal agency, more initiative, right? Permissionless.
I really appreciate the ability to describe it as she just has, because living organisms have a totally different methodology of survival and sustainability than many of the organizations that we've created as humans. And taking that natural order and then finding a way to replicate it to an extent that's appropriate within our organizational existence can help build that interdependency that I believe is so critical to successful human interaction and accomplishment of any objective, whether it's economic or charitable, regardless of the goal of a group of people and regardless of how large. Utilizing those principles can help us become more effective, more purposeful, and more outcome as well as efficiency oriented, because that's the nature of the human system. You know, it is built to be inherently tensioned because organisms are both organisms in and of themselves, but each of them has an interdependency with the rest of the system. So how can we replicate that in human form in terms of our organization? And I've am so glad that she's been a part of educating me on that, because that really has opened a lot of doors.
So, for folks who are trying to imagine, as we talk about organisms and verticality versus horizontal hierarchy and human relationship, how can we start to paint a practical example? Like, if we were to take one system or organization in an industry, let's take real estate or construction, that currently suffers from that verticality, and how would we start to transform that into something that is more decentralized or horizontally structured? And how do we actually make that transformation? Like, do you have to demote people? Does it feel like a demotion? Or, how do you rearrange the social structure? Because you're saying you don't follow a chain of commands, you work cooperatively. So that was a twofold question. What's an example of that? And then how do we actually implement it?
So first of all, what I would like to jump right in to say, we don't do social engineering. Like I know that legal engineering can seem like a bit of social engineering because it's designing sort of the relationship and it's about the relationships between the people. But the idea in an organization, and in traditional organizations, we're already seeing this, right? Is like more empowerment, more leadership. Like everybody should be a leader. Like front line people often have a lot of value and wisdom because of their interacting directly with the customer, and therefore it's like, why shouldn't have a direct line of communication to decision making, or have more power to decide on certain issues themselves? I think it's not a matter of like rearranging people or demoting people, but allowing enough fluidity. So deconstructing just a little bit. I'm talking about rewilding, like, of the corporate and social structures a little bit, because it's loosening just a little bit, and then people would naturally navigate to their position of choice, or more responsibility, assumed responsibility, rather than being forced into something, right? It's like, what would you like? There are practices in the other, like even in the real estate industry. I think in the UK, I've seen this, where people are, when they go to work for a company, they work in every department and then they choose, right? And that, but they have a complete understanding, a 360 understanding of what's happening. So this is something that's very much, yeah, possible without a lot of struggle, right? It's like a more natural environment. They will be, and we're seeing examples, right, of this happening all the time. It's just perhaps it's not emphasized, because it's much more glamorous to focus on, oh, bad hierarchy, let's decentralize everything. Like in reality, should be modular, should be flexible, right? Collapsible. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a human need, I think, to go through a cycle of organizational formation that, regardless if it's a team of 4 people or an organization of 400,000 people, once formed, the natural next step of any group is to storm. Meaning, we've got a lot of conflict here. We have to find a way to either work through it and resolve it, or we'll just continue to waste our time fighting about it. That leads to the norming. What are the norms that we are now going to agree to work by and hold each other accountable to? So working with groups, one of the first things I always try to help them do on the front end of any endeavor is to create the ground rules by which they agree to operate, because that then becomes the norm for that group's activity going forward. With that, you can eliminate a lot of conflict, you can eliminate a great deal of misunderstanding, and then you are prepared to perform. And to me, that is what every team can and should do in order to be best at whatever they've gathered together to do. It's the norming, the creation of a code of conduct, ground rules of relationship, communication, conflict management. All of those are in a healthy set of norms that allow any group to perform better.
May I use a word from architecture or construction? Gritty, right? So it like, there is value in detention. Like, I think we've been trained by our common current structures to be afraid of conflict and to try to avoid conflict. But in reality, in conflict, and being able to hold that conflict with civility and then mindfulness, with consciousness, right? Sitting with it, and then there's suddenly there's a new solution coming, right? So that is like very much from the construction side, where it's like, yes, you have the tension, but sometimes the tension is part of it's a feature, right? The tension in itself is important. Of course, it's important to calculate properly, but then in human terms, we have more experiments than precise calculation.
I wish we could learn to see in an organizational setting conflict as an opportunity rather than just as a threat. Because if there's a conflict, that's a sign that something needs to change. Something needs to be improved in order to address that conflict. If we can take the time and find a way to work collaboratively, we can solve that problem and create a better organization and a better product and a better service by embracing conflict as an invitation into finding solutions to whatever caused that conflict. And as Ramona says, that's very antithetical to our culture. First, we don't want to let anybody see us sweat. Second, we don't want to let anybody know that we don't have all the answers. So it requires a transparency, an accountability, but a consensual submission to each other in the context of the rules of that organization.
Let's touch on accountability. I think that's a great segue. How does that change from traditional organizational structure to a DAO or decentralized model?
That's a good question. It's immediate response. I think the response would be faster, right? And then it would be more in terms of like assumed accountability. They sort of like, okay, so I'll hold myself to task, and then it's about being able to deliver on the promises. This is a problem we've had in early DAOs, actually, in terms of people like promising to do or proposing to do something, but then not actually coming and executing on it, right? And then it's like you have to create all these metrics and KPIs and track, and then there are projects that have tried to do retroactive funding because of this, and like how do you acknowledge contributions? This is it's something that's really important, like assumed responsibility. It's empowering, right? If you I get a chance to do this, right? It's like, oh, showing up on the podcast, amazing opportunities. Like it is a responsibility as well, right? If I don't show up, so people are, let's say, it's important for them to be willing to understand responsibility and accountability as power, as capability, right? The power is the ability to do something. Then, like, of course, you do it, and then you get more of it. It brings me to the proof of value, but I don't want to jump the gun on that. Yeah.
Oh, we're going to get to that. That's my favorite topic. Let me just simply say that we expect accountability, but it cannot be imposed. Accountability can only be accepted. And as we accept accountability, we are submitting ourselves to the responsibility expectations of others that we agree to. And unfortunately, too much of accountability is coercive, and it's not accountability. That's judgment, and that doesn't lead to effective organizational formation or structure. But DAOs, which is what we're focused on, is really a function of what the group, ideally at least, have agreed to submit themselves to. Because if we're going to have an organization of any number and it's going to be technologically driven or at least augmented, you have to have that constitution to begin with, to make that subsequent era of growth and performance subject to agreed norms. I mean, that's the way democracies are created, and often because of the decay in democratic principles, organizations can, in a political sense, find themselves adrift, and they're either going to come back to those founding principles, change them, or they're going to come up with an alternative way to deal with the issues that they face. I think it was Marx who came up with the notion of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Well, that's exactly, in my mind, how change takes place. If something's not working and it needs to be tested, if we do the right thing, we're going to, in an accountable way, find a new way, by agreement, to do things that need to be done. And regardless of size or purpose, that's the essence of human interaction.
I just continue on that thought.
Yes.
Because it's like law is a consensus reality, right? We made up these fictional things, and then we all pretend like it's real, and then like we all abide by it, and then of course it works, right? It's like it's a consensus reality. But if the consensus reality is too complex, if the rules, the normative environment is so overbearing that it reduces the ability of the individual to actually act and be empowered to act, then it becomes a problem. So this is where it's like, yes, agreement with flexibility to change, and also like keep it to the minimum, like maximum, let's say, freedom to act within a certain parameters, because that's how things move. What I've seen in a lot of cases, I've seen consensus paralysis in terms of like people working so hard to get to a consensus. And this is the point in like not just Taoist, but sociology 2.0, right? It's like, oh, we're just like go round and round and round to generate consensus. It's great. It's perfect when the goal is to create the coherence in a community that's sitting together, right? It's like you kind of like work through the issues together. It's not so great when you have a job to get that. Like, but there's work to do.
And back to that issue of centralization versus decentralized, I'm not sure that there is a binary answer to that question. I believe that any organization has to have some degree of centralization to do some things, but then another set of responsibilities of that group are to decentralize for the purpose of decision-making on more conceptual and more critical elements of the organization. So you might want to have centralized operations because that's essential to make decisions quickly to a delegated group of people that the group approves as being their executive group. But the core decisions about the principles, the policies, the relationships has to be more decentralized in order for it to be embraced and accepted by the group in a very demonstrable way.
Well, I think that's a great example would be company culture, where the company culture cannot necessarily be shaped by a leader saying, we are this and our people are this. It it's naturally composed or formulated by the way that the people happen to act. And so I think that's a great example where if you look at the principles of the Tao or the belief system that's held within the people, it just comes as a product of the people. It's not enforced upon them. Right. Exactly. Now you had mentioned proof of value. Let's dive into it.
Okay. So how did this generate? So I'm not the only one working on this. I found at least a couple of other projects that are working in this direction, right? It's like, and we all know that there's dimensions of value, the various dimensions of capital, like people have been working on. But the idea was that, okay, so I have mission, vision, values. How can I communicate in a good way to a potential contributor? This is what I want. This is what I need, right? So again, this exercise, it's more of a process where we agree on what we value, and the hierarchy of values is important because people generally have similar values in this space, right? But the hierarchy of values, like which one has priority when there is a cost, right? When you have to sacrifice some, it's like which one comes first. And then based on that, we sort of like create this model with the parameters we want to track in terms of these are contributions we need and value, and these are acts or behaviors which are value destroying for us. This has two advantages. First of all, it creates coherence with the group, with the project, because you repeat this process at regular intervals, and then you acknowledge those contributions that were valuable to move the needle where you wanted, right? People feel seen, but also people not feel judged or threatened because it's not about their worth. It's about what they can contribute to the values of the organization. It's not about their personal worth, right? So when their contributions are measured or valued, it's always relative to something else, and it doesn't impinge on their core value as a person. And I think this is very important because in traditional organizations, this is mostly the problem, right? We're like performance and being seen of value and like questioning our values if we're not fitting without a certain parameter, right? Because it's like the dimensions of value are very few, right? We have time and we have money. So can we design some more complex process? And I'm very interested to collaborate on this.
Well, and one of the organizations with which we all have familiarity is the HERO organization, which is the Building and Information Management profession associated with the architecture, engineering, and construction industry, or AEC. And this group has, for the past 3 years, been working on those visions, values, and mission to the point of seeking to establish a consensus-based acceptance of what those core driving forces are. And we want to go from that concept theoretically into an actual operating system for the construction industry to illustrate how accountability, transparency, immutability, all of the things that are not present in the current system can be actually effectuated and proven. So we are moving into a proof of value exercise, not simply to do a proof of concept, but to show that these concepts we currently hold are either workable or not, change them if they need to be changed, but at the end of that sprint, be able to say, okay, this is how it can work, this is the value that it will add, or change any component or variable in it so that it does achieve value. And I think that is really very unusual in the startup community, because startups typically have a great idea that somebody hammers into the ground and makes sure everybody goes along with them to achieve their dream. So I think that's an example with proof of value.
And there's value in that, if I may. Is like the team that's very focused, very aligned, is strike through almost, and then they pierce through because they're so aligned and they're doing their thing, right? But then in bigger organizations, they need to be more stable, more long enduring, and then be accountable to many stakeholders, take into account different interests. You do need that consensus building exercise that gets done with the value processing.
Sticking on the AECO, architecture, engineering, and construction industry, for these folks, as they move to models where proof of value is present, how do they actually interact with that? Like, if we were to say, this is how your life changes, this is your job now, and this is what it looks like afterwards, how would we actually describe that? Like, in the most practical terms, for someone who is an architect, an engineer, contractor, or the like, how do they see that realized?
Well, I think we've all been a part of systems that were very unsatisfactory to us, and we were either assigned or chose a function in order to meet the expectations of others that were either effective or ineffective by the way in which we related to that organization. And whether, I mean, I was an employee in an enormous automotive industry model, and I could not understand how they made a dime because it was so dysfunctional at the employee relations level. So we can all identify those. But if we're going to answer that question, we have to create a system by which people can find their identity, their capabilities, their inclinations, all of who they are better served than simply in a very limited sense. And that's the interdependency that we hope to establish that creates value for every participant in an interdisciplinary way where everyone ideally, understand that's an ideal, finds their optimal place of value. Whether they're at an executive level or whether they're housekeeping, it doesn't matter. I'm doing what I enjoy doing, and I'm doing it the best that it can be done because what I'm doing is valued by the whole. That's a idealistic concept, but a proof of value exercise seeks to establish that.
And this not just words, right? So this is like something very important in terms of like, I think we all are familiar with the big corporations, sort of like mission, vision, values, lots of committees, lots of work, lots of like interviews, and then nothing changes or it doesn't change significantly, right? And that's not what this is, right? For the proof of value. I think it's about the clarity and the alignment of the individual and of the unity they are working, like the unit, the team, and it starts with the individual because this is a self-inventory. It's like, okay, this is what I know how to do. This is what I can have to offer that is of value. This is what I can contribute. This is what I want to do go into direction. This is what I want to learn. And then there's this Japanese concept of ikigai, right? There's sort of like the mix, the merger of these areas where we can contribute, where we love, what we are passionate about. And by doing the skill mapping exercise, and then I have a few good resources, including someone I work with to collaborate there if anyone is interested. But in terms of like very powerful self-exercise and then removing that dysfunction, identifying dysfunctions and then removing dysfunctions from that. I think that clarity is really the key.
An example of what that might mean. I mean, we are both lawyers. There's no way in the world I could ever do what she does because I've never done it before. I'm a lawyer. I'm trained in legal principles, but my work has been on an entirely different plane. So just the fact that we both have the same credentials does not mean we can perform the same functions equally well. But I can become completely interdependent on Ramona's expertise, as I would hope that she could become interdependent with mine as this organization begins to take shape in which all are serving at their highest and best use in a collaborative way. And that, to me, is the essence of an exceptionally strong organization.
If bringing it back to the centralization versus decentralization, because I think this is really key. So the reason why corporations exist is that there was a theory of the firm that said that we work better, we have fewer costs, there's less waste when we can trust the people we work with because they're within the same organization, right? Instead of doing like peer-to-peer sort of like market type of like where there is high information asymmetry. Now, with the blockchain technology and the peer-to-peer, we can do that better with outside parties. So we have less concentration that's needed within the firm. And then the organisms can be smaller, like the organizations can be smaller and more agile and then collaborate with each other in a much better way. This is why I'm saying, and if we want to do a biology aspect, like look at the human body. There's centralized nervous system. There is the centralization for everything that functions best when it's decentralized. We have the centralization. Like my body knows how to heal. It's like I don't have to think about healing, right? I wouldn't be able to breathing. Like, of course.
Very interesting. So talking about corporations, that made me think of business models. What type of new business models do you think will emerge out of this new form of organizational structure and the proof of value concept?
I like to refer to a book, of course, I'm an educator, that really influenced me thinking along these lines more than any other. And it's Frederic Laloux, a French scientist and organizational specialist. And the book is called Reinventing Organizations. And what he did was chart the history of organization from family to tribe to feudal to military, all the way through to what we've now come to know as the centralized organization, just that highly visible and in its own day and time, a highly successful corporation. And the question is that continuing to serve us well? And then he moved on in his development of organizational theory to the egalitarian model, in which everybody had a vote and everything was done by a democratic count of who was in favor and who was not, and that simply didn't work. But then he went to the interdependent model, and this is, in my view, what we're striving to achieve here. Is organizations, and he has case studies to establish the success of these organizations over time, they're hard to sustain, but when we can create an interdependent group of people functioning together, as Ramona just said, there's a high degree of satisfaction, a high degree of productivity, a high degree of profitability, because everyone has a stake in this endeavor. And that's the theory that we're trying to materialize. And a DAO gives us the structural technological wrapper within which to try to do that.
And we do have examples from the actual economy, right? We have these stories where the employees become the owners because someone exits, as like retires, and it's like they distribute their entire company to the employees, and then it works really well, right? Or we do have the stories where there the cooperatives are a very big success. If you look at the statistics of the cooperatives in the world, right, and how much of the global GDP they are, that's a big success story of this organizational structure, which has persisted across centuries. Right. So this is where like we have plenty of examples to work to learn from. We have the technology now to build better. And this brings me to the legal engineering. And then like we do need to have standards and interoperability also, because what I'm seeing a lot in the legal system is fragmentation and then infighting, and that creates waste.
And we're also seeing the confluence of technologies that are actually threatening that old business model of law, but I also think it's threatening the old business model of most industry. Because where there's an industry that thrives on waste, there's a problem because its constituents, its stakeholders, its clients, its patients are not being well served at the expense of those who have centralized control. Well, that's law to a great degree today because it's in the hands of a handful, literally, proportionately, of people who have assumed that they have the sole right to define what is and is not legal. When technology is now giving people the opportunity to check that against valuable outcomes through AI and other tools, that now that shift in power over the right to decide has taken shape, and the old ways are under attack. And we see it all the time. Ramona and I just saw this week a decision by a judge that uh, that held that a criminal defendant who utilized AI to understand some of the criminal allegations against him and used AI was not protected by the attorney-client privilege because he had, one, used a general AI platform, and it wasn't private data, so it wasn't confidential data, and it wasn't instructed by or under the counsel of an attorney. Well, strictly speaking, that may be correct, but that means that there's something wrong with a system that won't allow people who need justice to be able to acquire the information they need to serve themselves without having to have an intermediary who's going to charge more money than they care to pay or are able to pay to help them achieve justice. That's a tension that we're currently facing that, to Ramona's point, is going to require legal engineering.
Right.
And I also believe it's going to bring about a legal reinvention of the way in which law is distributed more equitably, more affordably, and more broadly than by the gatekeepers.
Fascinating. How long do you think it will take to roll that out?
I think it's going to happen quite fast.
Really?
Why? Because the technology is mature now, right?
And when we say technology, I assume we're generally speaking to AI and blockchain?
Yes.
That too. But I mean, blockchain and let's talk about the cybersecurity threat of quantum computing, which is on the doorstep. I mean, it's next door, and we're sitting back waiting for this trauma to take place. But yes, technology in all of its forms that continues to emerge at an exponential rate of speed, and you can't predict exponential. It's not possible to see where it's going, but we are, as humans, allowing it to function on its own, and how often are we able to exercise the check to make sure that the human interests are being protected? So it's an immensely transformative moment because of justice and technology are now in opposition.
Maybe that's the right moment. So, my co-founder, one of my co-founders at Ixion, is very passionate about deflating legal costs and also very passionate about getting lawyers to be literate. What he calls getting lawyers to be literate, because he argues that the entire internet is based on a lawyer's inventions, Charles Goldfarb, and then like the entire internet system built on that language. But the lawyers haven't learned that language yet, refuse to learn that language. Whereas it would be possible for lawyers to provide legal services at much lower cost, a fraction of a cost, much better quality, if they were literate in that computer, language. Here we go. I've said it. I've been resisting. It's sort of like, I'm not illiterate. It's just a foreign language that I'm not speaking.
And that's
But
why,
yeah, I have to assume it.
and that's why I teach in two law schools, Vanderbilt Law School and Arizona State Law School. And those courses that I teach are experiential; they're not doctrinal. And in each of them, regardless of topic, I want to be able to help law students become AI literate, blockchain literate, DAO literate. That doesn't mean they have to become engineers, or they just need to understand the impact of these technologies on the practice of law and their clients, and which is an ethical responsibility.
Yeah, that's that's the mandatory requirement, right? Lawyers have a mandatory requirement to understand the technology. Like that, this is something that's part of the ethics duties, and then like it's not negotiable. But beyond that, right? It's like we're looking at the legal tech of today, which is just reading hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages faster and processing the information faster. But then tomorrow, because of the AI agents, we'll have AI agent of organization A talk to AI agent of the organization B. It's not going to happen in a contract of 400 pages in PDF. So, like, literally, lawyers have a duty learn and then to get into this messy space. And then I'm the first one to say is like, oh my God, this is a huge undertaking. But it's going to happen fast because the developers are building it with lawyers or without it. So yeah.
And if I can just take that a step further, the ethical responsibility in the United States under the ABA's model rules and virtually every state's local ethical responsibilities, lawyers can lose their law license, as they should, if they don't stay abreast of developing legal standards and decisions and development. Well, that same ethical rule applies to technology that will be of impact on their clients. And we have yet to embrace our own rules of ethical behavior by being sure that we do both of those things, because they impact our clients' interests so greatly.
This is heavy. Maybe a lighter question.
I was scrolling my notes to see if there were a lighter question. I also noticed that we're starting to approach the top of the hour here, so we'll want to take our foot off of the gas pedal a little bit and probably start to wrap up. So let's talk about first. Is there anything calling back and looking at the conversation now? We covered a lot, right? We went from we try to avoid social engineering and just focus on legal engineering, and we mentioned BIM heroes and a shout out to Ralph Montag. I think he's probably the person I shout out most on all of my Coding Concrete episodes, just because the BIM heroes community has so much opportunity there and how it's restructuring responsibility, accountability, all the different elements that we discussed here today. So looking at that as well, is there any comments that you feel we should have added or something that you wanted to cover and I didn't frame a question?
I would want to say that lawyers and engineers and architects are closer together than we previously thought, right? It's like law is almost like invisible architecture that we're living in.
Hmm.
And the systems we inhabit are impacting us and are changing us in significant ways we're not always aware of. In the same way, we're living in a certain building is like a cathedral is very different than a cubicle, right? And then it shapes people differently. In the same way, law can shape human behavior in ways which are invisible and unknowable. And we have a high responsibility to build law as infrastructure with the values coded in.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? In the U.S., one of our founding principles is liberty and justice for all. Well, I think that's not only our ethos as a nation, but to the extent we're not delivering on that commitment, we're having a much harder time of keeping our dream alive. So if liberty and justice are foundations of this community we call America, then lawyers are at the helm of making and helping that happen. And I call on all of us to join in that effort, whether it's through technology, methodologies, politics, whatever. We have an overarching responsibility to make sure that those goals are achieved.
And doubling down on that, I would like to offer a call to action from both of you. A lot of listeners are going to be real estate professionals, wide range. It could be developers, investors, or specialized, and then a lot of technologists. If they were to start to implement these strategies in their organizations, how should they go about that? And then do you have a broader call to action for people who would like to get more involved or advocate for this more egalitarian, more horizontal organizational structure?
Well, I would encourage people to pick up the reference you've already made to BIM Heroes DAO. And if you want to find it on the internet and just be a part of that community, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, www.bimhero.io. But I'm sure you can superimpose that on this podcast.
We'll have a link in the description.
Perfect. But the point is that there a lot of work has been done, and it's not proprietary work. It's work for all to learn from and apply where appropriate, although focused on the AEC industry, the principles are transferable, virtually every industry. But it's a great place to understand what we're talking about in real terms. That would be my call to action. Thank you, Ralph Montague.
Personally, I would say that, so first of all, a nudge to eTdenver and then to Ethereum community. I found a lot of developers that are like working, coding, open source, sharing their resources. There is a lot of good ethos, and that this is a community that offers a lot. And then like that's one call to action. And then on the legal side, I would like to launch an invitation to lawyers is like, think about business angels and how instrumental they are to the economic substrate of an economy. Lawyers can be legal angels and then reinvent law and contribute and support this and then learn and then get in there and then start doing things in the same way. So yeah, a call for legal angels.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate the conversation with you both. Talking to lawyers is not something I usually do, but
Or want to do, probably.
that's many people might have that stigma, but you two are certainly the friendlier lawyers to work with. And being able to wrap the conversation around ethics. I mean, Larry, you mentioned earlier you took that leap out of the legal work itself. You can make a lot of money that way, but the value that you are delivering to people, you wanted to reorient that essentially instead of just structuring this for the system. How can we start to deliver for people themselves as individuals? So I think that's great that you have that ethics embedded into your. I don't know if your practice would be the right term here because it's, but at least in your approach to the legal system. I appreciate that both. And then, of course, taking the time to have a conversation here and jump in and out of all sorts of topics. And at Denver, of course, it's been a very exciting event. So much going on. Everything from some guy who it looks like the Grinch, but he's selling matcha tea, I think. So we've got that. We had robots walking around.
I saw a unicorn. I don't know.
Someone dressed as a unicorn and astronauts and all sorts of conversations about cryptocurrency.
Yep.
But that common denominator still being the decentralization of systems, whether that's legal systems or financial and economic or social structures. So I think we're having this conversation in the right place. It's super exciting. So thank you so much. And for all the listeners, I'm always going to have your details in the show notes that people can connect and BIM, maybe get involved in BIM Heroes.
And thank you for asking. This has been a great exchange. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for inviting.
Absolutely. Until next time, then.
And I've been to a number, and you all have been to far more blockchain, Web3 gatherings than I. But every time I go to one, I'm just so amazed about the enthusiasm of a generation that's prepared to embrace a new way of doing things. And I think that we're in good hands. So it's fun to watch.
Well, that's why I appreciate the roles that you've taken on, because I mean, maybe you could frame it as a new gen thing, and I'm Gen Z. And I think that a lot of my generation seem to have this ethos. But the fact that you both want to be educators and leaders and mentors of sorts, and like a podcast is the perfect forum for that, to say, look, there's a lot of people who are looking to reconstruct what the world looks like 10, 20, 30 years from now. How can we have a positive influence over that and offer some guidance?
So make sure that gets into the recording.
We can include it. As long as
Future living. Okay.
the camera is still running.
Yeah, well, it will be until we walk away.
After show banter, I've always noticed that when I wrap up the podcast, some of the best, because you take an hour, you say a lot, and then you kind of let that settle, and usually afterwards are when you have some of the most iconic lines,
Right.
really profound ideas, well put. I've done a lot of podcasts, but I still struggle to put my thoughts together sometimes.
Well, you do an excellent job. Fabulous at it, Matt.
But being able to converse for an hour, that usually kind of ties up loose ends, and
we always walk away and, oh, I wish I had said, or, oh, I shouldn't have said that. So, that just goes with the territory.
that's true. That's true.
No, especially when I see what comes out of this, I'll say, oh, did I actually? That's
Well, I think neither of you said anything that you might regret, of course. But if there's anything that you wish you said, if you want to include it now, and we'll insert it. Like,
I already compromised myself by admitting I'm not literate in computer things. So like, okay, fine.
all right. Well,
Thank you.
I think we now move this aside, and it'll just get cut.